The oldest promises are never written down. They survive because someone still remembers the song. Every Thursday evening, the north wing of Blackwood Children's Shelter grew quieter than the rest of Seattle. The older kids finished their homework. Volunteers folded blankets. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Elliott Bay, turning the fading daylight into silver ribbons that stretched across the polished wooden floor. Charlotte Hayes moved through the hallway carrying a basket of freshly folded towels, her simple Navy Maid uniform blending into the background the way she preferred. At 26, she had mastered the quiet art of becoming almost invisible. She fixed loose cabinet doors before anyone noticed. She remembered every child's favorite breakfast. She stayed late without asking for overtime because there was always another bed to make or another frightened child who needed someone to tell them tomorrow would be kinder than today. What she didn't know was that someone had already begun noticing her weeks earlier. Less than a mile away, a convoy of identical black SUVs rolled through the rain without making unnecessary noise. They belonged to people who rarely appeared in public without a reason. Tonight, their destination was the same shelter. Inside the building, Charlotte heard tiny footsteps racing down the hallway before a little boy collided gently into her apron. His name was Noah. 6 years old, quiet most days. Ever since arriving 3 weeks earlier, he had barely spoken more than a handful of words. The staff believed trauma had stolen his voice. Charlotte simply believed he was waiting until the world felt safe again. She knelt to straighten the blanket slipping from his small shoulders. She asked softly. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he stared past her toward the nursery door where another child had begun crying. It wasn't the loud cry of a tantrum. It was the exhausted cry of someone who had forgotten how to stop. Charlotte followed the sound into the nursery. A pale little boy sat alone in a rocking chair near the window while two caregivers exchanged helpless glances. Every attempt to comfort him had failed. Warm milk, storybooks, soft toys, nothing reached him. His unusually fair complexion caught the reflection of the storm outside, making him seem almost carved from moonlight. Charlotte didn't recognize him. The director had mentioned a private emergency placement arriving after sunset, but little else. He's been like this for nearly an hour, one caregiver whispered. He doesn't answer to his name. Charlotte slowly approached without rushing. Children often sensed fear faster than words. She crouched until her eyes met his. The little boy never looked away. His silver-grey eyes remained impossibly calm despite the tears resting on his cheeks. Something about that gaze felt strangely older than childhood itself. Charlotte reached into her apron pocket and offered him the tiny wooden bird Noah had carved during arts and crafts that afternoon. The boy accepted it with careful fingers but continued trembling. The room fell quiet except for the rain and the steady ticking of an old wall clock. Then, without planning to, Charlotte began humming. It wasn't a song she consciously remembered learning. The melody simply arrived, gentle as falling snow, rising from somewhere buried beneath years of ordinary life. The words followed naturally, soft enough that even she seemed surprised to hear them. The lullaby floated through the nursery like warm candlelight, finding forgotten corners. Noah slowly stepped closer. Another child stopped crying altogether. Even the restless wind outside seemed to lose its urgency. The pale boy's breathing steadied. His tiny fingers loosened around the wooden bird. Within moments, his eyelids grew heavy until he peacefully drifted asleep against the rocking chair. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Charlotte herself blinked, almost obsessed. "My grandmother used to hum something like that," she murmured quietly, though she could no longer remember when she had last heard it. At that exact moment, the front entrance opened downstairs. A tall man removed his rain-soaked coat before silently handing it to security. His tailored black suit looked untouched by the storm. Every employee instinctively stepped aside without understanding why. They only felt the impossible stillness that entered with him. Vincent Moretti followed the shelter director toward the nursery without saying a single unnecessary word. His expression never changed until he reached the doorway. Then he heard the final notes of the forgotten lullaby fading into silence. For the first time in centuries, the Vampire King stopped walking. Silence settled over the nursery so completely that even the rain seemed reluctant to interrupt it. Charlotte slowly lowered her hands, convinced she had simply stumbled upon an old melody buried somewhere in childhood. She glanced toward the caregivers with an awkward smile, expecting someone to laugh at the strange coincidence. Instead, both women stood perfectly still, their attention fixed not on the sleeping boy, but on the man who had quietly appeared at the doorway. Charlotte followed their gaze. The newcomer carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to entering any room without announcing himself. His dark-tailored suit fit with effortless precision, while the faint glow from the hallway outlined features so composed they almost seemed carved from marble. His pale face revealed nothing. His silver eyes, however, never left the child sleeping peacefully in the rocking chair. The shelter director hurried forward, speaking with careful politeness. "Mr. Moretti, we were not expecting you upstairs so quickly." Vincent Moretti acknowledged the greeting with the slightest nod, yet his attention never drifted away from the nursery. Charlotte assumed he must be the benefactor the director had mentioned during the morning meeting. Wealthy donors visited from time to time, although none had ever carried themselves with such unsettling stillness. She instinctively stepped backward to avoid standing in his path. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not realize someone was coming." Vincent finally looked at her. It lasted only a second, but the moment stretched strangely longer in Charlotte's mind. There was no anger in his expression, no surprise either. Only careful observation, as though he were comparing what he saw with something remembered long ago. Before either of them spoke again, the little boy stirred in the rocking chair. Every caregiver held their breath. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, the child opened his eyes without fear. He looked around the room calmly before turning toward Charlotte. Then something happened that no employee had witnessed since his arrival. He smiled. It was small and uncertain, but unmistakably genuine. One caregiver quietly covered her mouth. Another blinked away tears she had not expected. The director whispered, "He has not responded to anyone like that." Charlotte smiled back, relieved more than proud. Maybe he was just tired. Vincent slowly crossed the room until he stood beside the sleeping chair. The little boy reached out without hesitation and wrapped tiny fingers around the sleeve of his black jacket. It was a simple gesture, yet Vincent remained completely motionless, as though afraid the smallest movement might break an invisible thread. Charlotte noticed his hand hesitate before gently resting on the child's shoulder. His touch was careful, almost unfamiliar. What she could not know was that countless physicians, specialists, counselors, and private caregivers had failed to calm the child during the previous 6 months. Nothing had reached him, not until tonight. The shelter director quietly explained, "His legal guardians requested complete privacy. We only know he stopped sleeping after losing someone very important." Charlotte nodded with genuine sympathy. Children remember love differently than adults do. Vincent's eyes lifted toward her again. "Where did you learn that lullaby?" His voice was low and remarkably calm. Charlotte looked almost embarrassed by the question. "I wish I knew. My grandmother used to hum pieces of it while baking. I honestly thought I had forgotten it years ago." "Did she ever tell you where it came from?" "No. She only said some songs survive because someone refuses to forget them." A nearly invisible change crossed Vincent's expression before disappearing again. The director invited everyone downstairs for coffee and paperwork, but Vincent remained beside the rocking chair. Charlotte quietly gathered the folded blankets she had left near the nursery door, hoping to slip away unnoticed. As she reached the hallway, a gentle voice stopped her. "Miss Hayes." She turned. Vincent stood exactly where she had left him, yet somehow the entire room felt different. "Would you be willing," he asked with perfect courtesy, "to sing that lullaby again tomorrow evening?" Charlotte smiled politely, believing she was simply helping a frightened little boy sleep. "Of course," she answered without hesitation. "If it helps him rest, I would be happy to." Vincent thanked her with a quiet nod, but after she disappeared around the corner, he looked down at the sleeping child and whispered words no one else was close enough to hear. After 300 years, how can she still remember? And somewhere deep beneath the shelter, hidden inside a vault that had remained silent for generations, an ancient music box slowly began turning on its own. The following evening arrived wrapped in another curtain of steady rain, and the shelter settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet conversations, bedtime stories, and warm lights glowing against the grey Seattle sky. Charlotte arrived 30 minutes early, just as she always did on Thursdays, carrying a paper bag filled with homemade oatmeal cookies she had baked before sunrise. She left them in the staff kitchen without mentioning they were from her. Small kindnesses, she believed, did not need signatures. As she walked toward the nursery, she noticed subtle differences she could not explain. 2 additional security guards stood near the front entrance. A black luxury sedan remained parked across the street with its headlights turned off. Even the shelter director seemed unusually careful while speaking with visitors. Charlotte assumed another important donor had decided to stop by. She thought nothing more of it. Upstairs, Noah greeted her with a shy wave before returning to the wooden train set scattered across the floor. That alone felt like a miracle. Only yesterday, he had barely acknowledged anyone's presence. The pale little boy sat quietly near the window again, holding the same carved wooden bird Charlotte had offered him the night before. This time he looked less frightened. Curious, perhaps. Charlotte knelt beside him with a gentle smile. "Good evening." The child studied her face for several seconds before placing the bird carefully into her hand, as though returning something precious rather than borrowed. It was the first choice he had made voluntarily since arriving. One caregiver quietly whispered, "He has been waiting for you since dinner." Charlotte blinked in surprise. For me, the caregiver simply nodded. Before Charlotte could ask another question, footsteps echoed softly outside the nursery. Vincent Moretti entered without ceremony, accompanied only by the shelter director. Unlike the previous evening, he wore no overcoat, only a charcoal suit that seemed almost too formal for a children's shelter. Yet nothing about him felt uncomfortable among the toys, books, and colourful drawings taped to the walls. If anything, he looked strangely out of place in a way that made the room feel even more ordinary. Charlotte smiled politely. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti." His voice remained calm, but she noticed something different. The distance she had sensed yesterday seemed slightly smaller, replaced by careful curiosity. Vincent observed the pale boy, who had quietly stood and walked toward Charlotte before gently taking her hand. The movement lasted only a second, but every adult in the room noticed it. The director exhaled slowly. He has refused physical contact with everyone. Charlotte squeezed the little hand reassuringly without making a fuss over it. Sometimes children choose the person who asks for nothing. Vincent listened without replying. What she did not know was that every word she spoke sounded strangely familiar, echoing lessons preserved inside memories older than the city surrounding them. As bedtime approached, the nursery lights dimmed until only the warm glow of table lamps remained. Rain continued tracing silver lines across the windows. Charlotte settled into the old rocking chair with the little boy resting quietly beside her. Noah curled beneath a blanket only a few feet away, pretending to build towers from wooden blocks while secretly listening. Charlotte began humming the same gentle melody. This time she paid closer attention to the words, hoping they might reveal where they had come from. Instead, they felt almost instinctive, flowing naturally with each quiet breath. The pale boy closed his eyes almost immediately. Noah leaned against Charlotte's chair without saying a word. Even children in neighboring rooms gradually stopped whispering. The entire floor seemed wrapped inside the lullaby. Vincent remained standing near the doorway, perfectly still. His gaze never left Charlotte, but it was not admiration that filled his expression. It was recognition struggling against disbelief. He had searched libraries hidden beneath castles, forgotten monasteries, and private collections scattered across continents. Historians declared the melody permanently lost more than 3 centuries ago. Yet here it was, carried effortlessly by a young woman who believed it belonged to nothing more than an ordinary grandmother. When the final note faded into silence, the pale boy opened his eyes and spoke for the very first time. His voice was barely louder than a whisper. She remembered. Every caregiver froze. Charlotte smiled gently, assuming he meant the song. But Vincent's composure fractured for the briefest instant because he understood the impossible meaning behind those 2 simple words. And somewhere inside the deepest chamber beneath the Moretti estate, another ancient relic awakened. Responding to a lullaby that should not have existed in the modern world, morning sunlight finally broke through the clouds after nearly a week of relentless rain, covering the city in a pale golden glow that made Seattle seem softer than usual. Charlotte arrived at the shelter carrying fresh flowers gathered from the community garden a few blocks away. She placed small bouquets on the dining tables before the children woke, smiling to herself when she imagined their sleepy faces discovering tiny splashes of color beside their cereal bowls. The shelter slowly came alive with footsteps, laughter, and the familiar sounds of breakfast. Noah surprised everyone by asking for another pancake, while the pale little boy quietly remained beside Charlotte as she poured orange juice into paper cups. None of the staff questioned it anymore. Somehow her presence had become the one constant that settled the entire house. What Charlotte did not know was that several black vehicles had already surrounded the neighborhood before sunrise. Their passengers never entered the shelter. They simply watched. Inside the vehicles, conversations remained unusually quiet. Every report arriving from the previous 2 nights carried the same impossible conclusion. The forgotten lullaby had been heard again. Vincent Moretti read each report without speaking. Facts interested him more than speculation. The child had slept peacefully. His nightmares had disappeared. His pulse had stabilized. Even more unusual, the ancient relic beneath the Moretti estate had continued responding every time Charlotte sang. None of it should have been possible. Back inside the shelter, Charlotte found the little boy sitting alone in the reading corner, with a picture book open across his lap. She joined him on the carpet without interrupting his silence. Instead of reading aloud, she simply pointed toward the illustrations, letting him turn each page whenever he wished. After several minutes, he gently tapped one drawing of a family gathered beneath a large oak tree. "Pretty," he whispered. Charlotte smiled warmly. "Yes, home can look different for everyone." The child looked at her thoughtfully before asking another quiet question. "Do you remember your grandmother?" Charlotte, every single day. "Did she sing often?" "Almost every evening while baking bread or folding laundry." She paused, trying to remember more. "Strange thing is, I remember the feeling much better than the words." The little boy nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Less than 20 feet away, Vincent had entered the hallway unnoticed. He had not intended to overhear the conversation, yet every sentence seemed to erase another piece of certainty he had carried for centuries. If Charlotte truly remembered nothing, then someone else had deliberately preserved the melody through generations without explaining its importance. That possibility troubled him far more than if she had been hiding the truth. The shelter director approached Vincent quietly. "She has no idea why everyone keeps asking about the song." Vincent answered without taking his eyes off Charlotte. "That is exactly what concerns me." Later that afternoon, volunteers organized an art session in the recreation room. Sheets of white paper covered every table. Crayons rolled across bright blue plastic trays. Charlotte moved from child to child, helping them cut paper stars and fold colorful birds. The pale boy rarely participated in activities, yet today he carefully picked up a silver crayon. Without hesitation, he began drawing a large circular symbol surrounded by tiny musical notes. Charlotte leaned closer, fascinated by the unusual picture. "That is beautiful," she said sincerely. "Did you imagine it?" The little boy slowly shook his head. "It was on the ceiling." Charlotte looked upward automatically. Only white ceiling tiles stared back at her. She chuckled gently. "Maybe you dreamed it." The child frowned with innocent certainty. "No. It disappeared when you stopped singing." Charlotte smiled politely, assuming children often mixed dreams with reality. Vincent, however, had quietly stepped into the room just in time to hear every word. His eyes settled on the drawing. For one brief moment, the color left his face completely. The symbol was identical to one hidden beneath layers of stone inside the oldest chamber of his family's estate, a place no child could possibly have seen. He carefully picked up the drawing without frightening the boy. The child nodded. Vincent folded the paper with extraordinary care, as though it were far more valuable than ordinary crayon lines. Charlotte noticed his unusual seriousness but could not understand it. To her, it was simply another child's imagination. As the afternoon sun slowly faded behind the skyline, Vincent slipped the drawing into the inside pocket of his jacket and quietly realized that the impossible mystery surrounding Charlotte was becoming larger than a forgotten lullaby alone. And for the first time he began wondering whether someone had spent generations preparing for the exact moment she walked into that shelter. The drawing remained folded inside Vincent Moretti's jacket throughout the afternoon, yet it seemed heavier with every passing hour. By sunset he had already compared it with photographs stored in a private archive that only a handful of trusted historians had ever been allowed to enter. Every curve matched. Every tiny musical symbol occupied exactly the same place. There should have been no explanation. The original carving had remained hidden beneath layers of stone for nearly 300 years, sealed inside a chamber that no outsider had ever visited. Yet the child had drawn it from memory with the confidence of someone who had seen it only moments before. Across town, however, Charlotte finished washing paintbrushes without the slightest idea that an ordinary art project had unsettled one of the most powerful men in the city. Her thoughts remained far simpler. She worried about whether Noah had eaten enough vegetables at dinner. She wondered if the pale little boy preferred dinosaurs or airplanes. She quietly reminded herself to repair a loose bookshelf before the weekend volunteers arrived. Her world remained wonderfully ordinary. As evening settled over the shelter, children gathered in the common room for movie night. Blankets covered the carpet, popcorn filled paper bowls, laughter echoed through the hallway as animated characters bounced across the television screen. Charlotte noticed the pale little boy sitting slightly apart from the others. She carried an extra blanket across the room and gently wrapped it around his shoulders without interrupting the film. He looked up at her with calm silver eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. It was only the second complete sentence anyone had heard him speak. Charlotte smiled. "You are very welcome." A few minutes later, Noah quietly scooted closer until all three of them shared the same blanket. Neither child seemed interested in the movie anymore. Instead, they simply watched the warm lights reflecting across the windows while rain returned outside. Charlotte absent-mindedly began humming under her breath as she folded tiny paper stars from leftover craft supplies. She never realized she had started the same forgotten melody again. The tune remained softer than before, almost hidden beneath the sound of rainfall, yet both boys relaxed immediately. Their breathing slowed, their shoulders loosened. Peace settled naturally across their faces. Standing outside the room, Vincent observed everything through the partially open doorway. This time he noticed something different. Charlotte never intentionally performed the lullaby. It appeared whenever she focused entirely on comforting someone else. She did not think about the melody. She simply became kind, and somehow the song followed. That realization disturbed him more deeply than any ancient document ever had. The shelter director joined him quietly. "I have never seen children trust some so quickly," Vincent answered without looking away. "Neither have I. Do you believe it is only the music?" Vincent remained silent for several long seconds. Finally he replied, "No. The music is only the doorway." Before the director could ask another question, the pale little boy unexpectedly stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the rain-soaked playground. He gently placed one small hand against the glass. Charlotte followed him, assuming he wanted to watch the storm. Instead, he quietly pointed upward toward the cloudy sky. "Someone is listening." Charlotte looked outside. Nothing moved except drifting rain and swaying cedar trees. She smiled reassuringly. The boy slowly shook his head. "No, someone is waiting." His words lingered in the room long after he returned to the blanket. Charlotte assumed they belonged to a child's imagination shaped by difficult memories. Vincent knew better than to dismiss them so easily. He had heard children with extraordinary sensitivity speak that way before. Not often, not for centuries. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Charlotte gathered empty popcorn bowls and switched off the lights one by one. As she reached the nursery doorway, she noticed something tucked carefully beneath the rocking chair where she had sung during the previous evenings. It was an old silver music pendant no larger than the palm of her hand. Time had worn away most of its delicate engravings, but one detail remained perfectly clear. The tiny circular emblem on its cover was identical to the mysterious symbol the pale little boy had drawn earlier that afternoon. Charlotte picked it up with puzzled curiosity, completely unaware that at the exact same moment Vincent froze halfway down the hallway, because he felt an ancient relic somewhere beneath his estate answer the silent awakening of another artifact that should have remained lost forever. Charlotte turned the silver pendant over in her hands as the nursery lights dimmed for the night. It felt surprisingly warm despite resting beneath the rocking floor cooled by the evening rain. The worn chain had broken long ago, leaving only the small oval clasp attached to its delicate frame. She gently brushed away a layer of dust with her thumb, revealing tiny musical notes engraved around the circular emblem at its center. "Someone must have dropped this years ago," she whispered to herself. She slipped the pendant into the pocket of her apron, planning to leave it with the shelter's lost and found box the following morning. It never crossed her mind that anyone could still be searching for it. What she did not know was that Vincent Moretti had already stopped walking halfway down the hallway the instant she touched it. He did not hear a sound. He did not see a light. Instead, he felt a familiar presence ripple through something ancient that had remained silent for centuries. The sensation disappeared almost immediately, but it was enough. Someone else might have dismissed it as imagination. Vincent had lived too long to ignore impossible coincidences. He quietly excused himself from the shelter before anyone noticed the sudden urgency in his expression. Less than 30 minutes later, he stood alone inside the oldest chamber beneath the Moretti estate. Massive stone walls surrounded a circular room illuminated only by candles burning inside iron sconces. At the center rested an elaborate music box carved from dark walnut and polished silver. It had not played a single note in almost 300 years. Tonight, one tiny gear inside the mechanism had shifted by less than an inch. Vincent stared at it in complete silence. There was no logical explanation, no visible force had touched it, yet the movement had happened. He slowly unfolded the child's drawing beside the music box. The symbols still matched perfectly, the forgotten lullaby, the impossible sketch, now the pendant. Separate mysteries no longer felt separate at all. Meanwhile, Charlotte finished locking classroom doors before making one final stop at the nursery. The pale little boy already slept peacefully beneath a blue blanket, his breathing calm and steady. Noah had curled into the neighboring bed after insisting he wanted to sleep close to his new friend. Charlotte smiled at the quiet scene before adjusting a blanket that had slipped onto the floor. As she stood to leave, something unexpected happened. The silver pendant inside her apron pocket produced the faintest musical tone. It lasted less than a second, soft enough that she wondered whether she had imagined it. She paused and listened carefully. Nothing. The nursery returned to complete silence. Charlotte reached into her pocket and examined the pendant again. It refused to open despite several gentle attempts. "You are full of surprises," she murmured with an amused smile before placing it back inside her pocket. Across the room, the pale little boy slowly opened his eyes. "It likes you," he whispered sleepily. Charlotte turned with gentle curiosity. "What likes me?" The boy looked toward the pocket holding the pendant. It waited. Before Charlotte could ask another question, he had already drifted back to sleep. She quietly laughed to herself. Children often gave personalities to ordinary objects. It was one of the many things she loved about working at the shelter. Early the next morning, sunlight poured through the dining hall windows while volunteers prepared breakfast. Charlotte carried the pendant to the front office intending to report it. The shelter administrator searched through decades of inventory records, but eventually shook her head. "No matching description. Whatever it is, it has never been logged here." Charlotte frowned slightly. "Maybe someone donated furniture and it came with it." "Possible," the administrator replied. "Why not keep it safe until someone asks?" Charlotte hesitated before slipping it back into her pocket. She felt strangely responsible for the tiny keepsake, though she could not explain why. Just outside the office window, a familiar black sedan quietly pulled into the parking lot. Vincent stepped out carrying a simple white bakery box instead of the expensive gifts wealthy benefactors usually delivered. The children rushed toward the entrance the moment they recognized him, laughing more freely than they had only days earlier. Charlotte watched from the hallway, surprised to see how naturally he smiled at them now. It was small, almost hesitant, but unmistakably real. For the first time she wondered whether the quiet man behind the tailored suits might be carrying loneliness of his own. She had no way of knowing that Vincent had not returned merely to visit the children. He had come because somewhere inside that ordinary silver pendant resting unnoticed in Charlotte's apron pocket lay the final missing piece of a mystery that had remained unsolved longer than the United States had existed. Vincent greeted every child by name before setting the white bakery box on the cafeteria table, allowing eager little hands to discover cinnamon rolls still warm from the oven. Charlotte watched from across the room, quietly surprised by how naturally the children gathered around him. The reserved businessman who had first walked through the shelter with unreadable composure now listened patiently as Noah explained the rules of a board game, while another child proudly displayed a drawing of a bright yellow dragon. Nothing about Vincent's gentle smile seemed rehearsed. It appeared slowly, almost as though the children themselves had reminded him how to use it. Charlotte poured fresh orange juice into paper cups before carrying one toward him. "You did not have to bring breakfast," she said warmly. Vincent accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "Perhaps not, but they deserve ordinary mornings whenever possible." Charlotte smiled. "I could not agree more." For several quiet moments they simply watched the children laugh together beneath the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Then Vincent's attention shifted almost imperceptibly toward the apron pocket where the silver pendant rested. "May I ask you something?" he said gently. "Of course. Have you found anything unusual recently?" Charlotte hesitated before removing the pendant and placing it carefully on the table between them. "Actually, I found this beneath the rocking chair in the nursery 2 nights ago. Nobody recognizes it." Vincent looked at the tiny keepsake without touching it. Even from a distance he recognized every delicate engraving, the emblem, the musical notes, the worn silver frame. His expression remained composed, but the weight of 3 centuries settled silently behind his eyes. "May I examine it?" Charlotte slid the pendant toward him without hesitation. The instant Vincent's fingertips brushed against the silver surface, the tiny clasp released with a soft metallic click. Charlotte blinked in surprise. "I tried opening it several times." Neither of them had applied any noticeable pressure. The pendant had simply decided to unlock. Inside rested a miniature portrait protected beneath aged crystal. Charlotte leaned closer, expecting to see strangers whose identities had long been forgotten. Instead, she froze. The young woman painted astonishingly familiar. She shared Charlotte's gentle features, The same warm eyes and even the slight curve of her smile. Only her clothing belonged to another century. Vincent closed his eyes for the briefest in a whisper. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft. Charlotte looked up in confusion. You knew her? Yes. His answer carried no hesitation. More than 300 years ago. Charlotte gave a small, uncertain laugh, assuming he must be referring to family history. You mean one of your ancestors knew her? Vincent remained silent long enough for the room around them to fade beneath the distant laughter of children. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. No, I knew her. Charlotte searched his face for any sign of humor. There was none. Only quiet certainty. Before she could respond, the pale little boy approached the table carrying the wooden bird she had given him on the first night. He looked at the open pendant before gently placing the bird beside it. She came back, he said simply. Charlotte instinctively shook her head. No, sweetheart. I only look like her. The child smiled with surprising confidence. Not her, the promise. Vincent slowly lifted his eyes toward Charlotte. At last, the scattered pieces aligned into a single truth he could no longer ignore. 3 centuries earlier, Eleanor Ashcroft had served as caretaker to orphan children hidden during one of the darkest chapters in his family's history. She had refused wealth, titles, and protection for herself, asking only that every frightened child receive a safe place to sleep and a song before bed. Before her peaceful passing many decades later, she entrusted the ancient lullaby, the silver pendant, and one final promise to her own family. She believed that kindness would someday be needed again, even if her descendants never understood why they had inherited an old song. Charlotte stared silently at the tiny portrait while her fingers unconsciously touched the edge of the pendant. Everything she had believed was ordinary suddenly felt connected to a history she had never known existed. Vincent did not see Eleanor when he looked at her. He saw something even more extraordinary. He saw a family that had quietly kept its promise for 300 years without ever realizing it, and for the first time since entering the shelter, Charlotte understood that the forgotten lullaby had never survived by accident. Charlotte carried the open pendant carefully to the quiet reading room after breakfast, hoping a few moments away from the excited children would help everything make sense. Sunlight spilled across rows of old books while dust drifted lazily through the warm morning air. The shelter had always been her safest place, yet for the first time it suddenly felt filled with questions instead of answers. Vincent followed several minutes later, closing the door softly behind him. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer came from uncertainty. It came from respect for the story waiting to be told. Charlotte rested the pendant on the wooden table. You said you knew Eleanor. Vincent nodded once. She worked in a children's refuge during the winter of 1726. Charlotte looked down at the painted portrait again. She looks exactly like me. She was your ancestor. Charlotte let out a slow breath. My grandmother never mentioned any of this. Vincent's expression softened. She may never have known the full truth herself. Charlotte frowned slightly. Then how did the song survive? Vincent looked toward the nursery windows where distant laughter echoed through the hallway. Because every generation taught it to the next without explaining why. Some promises are protected not by secrets but by kindness, repeated so many times that people mistake them for ordinary traditions. Charlotte quietly absorbed every word. She remembered standing beside her grandmother's kitchen counter while fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. She remembered warm hands brushing flour from her hair. She remembered humming together without ever asking where the melody came from. Suddenly those ordinary memories felt connected to life stretching back centuries. So my family was simply preserving it, she asked, without realizing what they carried. Vincent answered gently, yes. Before another question could follow, Noah burst into the room holding a stack of handmade paper airplanes. Miss Charlotte, we are having a flying contest. Charlotte laughed immediately. Then I suppose I should defend my championship. Noah grinned proudly before racing back into the hallway. Vincent watched the exchange with quiet admiration. She had just learned something that would leave most people overwhelmed, yet her first instinct remained to keep a promise to a child. Nothing about her kindness seemed forced. It simply existed. A few minutes later, the recreation room filled with laughter as colorful paper airplanes floated beneath the high ceiling. Charlotte cheered every successful throw regardless of whose airplane landed farthest. Even the pale little boy joined the game, carefully folding his first airplane before launching it with a tiny smile that drew applause from everyone nearby. Vincent stood near the doorway, watching children who only days earlier had struggled to trust anyone now laugh together without fear. The shelter felt brighter than it had in months. What Charlotte could not see was the quiet gratitude growing behind Vincent's calm expression. 300 years earlier, Eleanor had once told him that children measured wealth differently than adults. They counted warm meals, gentle voices, safe beds, and people who stayed when promises became inconvenient. He had never forgotten those words. Now, as he watched Charlotte kneel to help Noah repair a torn paper wing instead of discussing ancient mysteries, he realized history had not repeated itself. It had quietly continued. Later that afternoon, the pale little boy wandered toward the nursery window, the silver pendant gently swinging from Charlotte's hand as she examined its delicate engravings once more. The child smiled before pointing toward the tiny portrait inside. "She is happy," Charlotte smiled back. "How do you know?" The boy looked at Charlotte instead of the painting. "Because you kept singing." Vincent heard the answer from across the room. For centuries he had believed the pendant, the lullaby, and the hidden relic beneath his estate existed to preserve forgotten history. Standing inside the shelter, surrounded by children building paper airplanes and laughing beneath afternoon sunlight, he finally understood they had never been created to remember the past. They had been preserved to protect the future whenever kindness was needed again. As Charlotte gently closed the pendant and slipped it safely back into her apron pocket, neither of them noticed the old rocking chair near the nursery window move ever so slightly on its own, settling into perfect stillness as though an invisible promise that had waited across 3 centuries had finally found its way home. The days that followed no longer felt ordinary, although Charlotte tried her best to keep them that way. Every morning still began with warm oatmeal, missing socks, spilled orange juice, and children arguing over whose turn it was to feed the shelter's old tabby cat. She quietly repaired broken toys, folded tiny sweaters, and reminded Noah to finish his reading before racing outside. If history had truly reached across 3 centuries to find her, it certainly did not excuse her from making peanut butter sandwiches for 12 energetic children. Somehow that simple thought made her smile. Vincent visited more frequently, yet never in a way that disturbed the shelter's peaceful routine. He arrived carrying books instead of expensive gifts, donated winter coats without placing his name on them, and patiently listened as children explained imaginary kingdoms built from cardboard boxes. Charlotte noticed how naturally they accepted him now. The distance that had once surrounded him continued fading each day. One afternoon she found him kneeling beside Noah, helping repair a wooden train whose tiny wheel had fallen off. "I did not know you fixed toys," Charlotte said as she approached with a basket of clean laundry. Vincent looked up with a faint smile. "I have had a long time to practice fixing things." Charlotte laughed softly, assuming it was another quiet joke about his successful business career. "You are getting better at those." "Perhaps," he answered, "or perhaps I finally found people worth practicing for." She paused for a moment, surprised by the warmth hidden inside such a simple sentence. Before either of them could continue, the pale little boy appeared carrying an old picture frame discovered in a storage closet scheduled for renovation. "Miss Charlotte," he asked, "does this belong here?" Dust covered the cracked wooden frame, but beneath years of neglect remained a faded photograph of the shelter taken nearly a century earlier. Charlotte carefully brushed away the dust. Children filled the front steps, smiling proudly beside several caretakers dressed in clothing from another era. She studied each face with quiet fascination until something caught her attention. Standing near the center was an elderly woman wearing a simple apron. Even through the faded black and white photograph, Charlotte recognized the gentle expression immediately. "That is my grandmother," she whispered in disbelief. Vincent stepped closer. His eyes moved slowly across the old photograph before settling on another figure standing quietly beside Charlotte's grandmother. The man's face appeared younger than the decade suggested, dressed in a dark overcoat despite the bright summer day. Most people would have overlooked him entirely. Charlotte did not. She looked from the photograph to Vincent, then back again. Her breathing slowed. "That cannot be possible." Vincent remained silent. Charlotte traced the image with one careful fingertip. "He looks exactly like you." The room grew remarkably still. Outside, children laughed on the playground while autumn leaves drifted across the shelter lawn. Inside, only the quiet ticking of the old hallway clock interrupted the silence. Charlotte searched Vincent's face for an explanation. This time she no longer laughed away impossible answers. Too many impossible things had already become real. Vincent finally spoke with gentle honesty. "Your grandmother knew me." Charlotte looked up slowly. "She never mentioned anyone named Vincent. She knew me by another name." Charlotte's thoughts raced through every childhood memory she could recall. Her grandmother had often spoken about a quiet benefactor who appeared whenever the shelter struggled through difficult winters, a man who never accepted recognition, a man the children simply called Mr. Vale because nobody knew anything else about him. Charlotte had always believed he was little more than a generous local businessman whose story had gradually become family legend. She looked once more at the faded photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. "You were here," she whispered, "decades ago." Vincent nodded gently, long before either of us imagined we would meet again. Charlotte lowered herself into the nearest chair, not because she felt frightened, but because the timeline of her own family's history had suddenly stretched far beyond anything she had ever imagined. She realized the shelter had never simply been her workplace. For generations it had quietly connected two families through nothing more extraordinary than children, kindness and promises kept without expecting reward. As afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and illuminated the old photograph, Charlotte noticed one final detail almost hidden in the background. Hanging above the nursery doorway was the very same silver pendant she now carried every day, proving it had never been lost at all. It had been waiting for exactly the right hands to find it again. Charlotte stood quietly beneath the nursery doorway, holding the faded photograph beside the silver pendant as late afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the wooden floor. The two objects belonged to different centuries, yet together they told a single story. She gently returned the photograph to its frame before slipping the pendant back into her apron pocket. Nothing about her felt extraordinary. She still had laundry waiting downstairs, a broken bookshelf to repair, and 12 children expecting dinner before sunset. Whatever history had chosen to preserve, it had arrived in the middle of an ordinary life. Vincent remained beside the window, watching her with calm respect rather than expectation. He did not ask her to become someone else. He did not ask her to carry responsibilities she had never chosen. Instead, he quietly picked up the old photograph and carefully placed it on a nearby shelf. "Your grandmother believed that children deserved a peaceful evening no matter what the world looked like outside," he said softly. Charlotte smiled at the familiar thought. She used to say that a warm meal could make tomorrow feel possible. Vincent nodded. She never stopped believing that. Before the conversation could continue, laughter echoed from the playground. Noah burst through the hallway carrying a bright red kite almost twice his height. "Miss Charlotte, the wind is perfect." She laughed and followed him outside without hesitation. The shelter lawn overlooked Elliott Bay, where a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar trees and salt water. Volunteers helped younger children untangle kite strings while others chased colorful streamers dancing across the grass. Charlotte knelt beside Noah, patiently fixing a twisted knot before sending the kite climbing into the blue afternoon sky. The pale little boy stood nearby, his eyes following the kite until it floated higher than the rooftop. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, he laughed out loud. It was a quiet sound, but every adult on the lawn stopped what they were doing. The shelter director smiled through moist eyes. I had almost forgotten what his laugh sounded like. Charlotte looked toward the little boy with genuine happiness. She never realized that her presence had become the safest place he knew. Vincent remained several steps away, allowing the children to enjoy the moment without interruption. He noticed something that no one else seemed to see. The silver pendant resting beneath Charlotte's apron reflected a brief flash of sunlight, sending a tiny circle of light across the grass before fading again. There was no mystery left in the gesture, no warning, no miracle. It simply felt as though something long unfinished had finally settled into peace. As evening approached, everyone gathered around picnic tables for a simple outdoor dinner. Sandwiches, fresh fruit and homemade lemonade disappeared quickly beneath cheerful conversation. Charlotte moved from child to child, making sure every plate stayed full before sitting down herself. Vincent quietly carried an extra tray to one of the volunteers who had been too busy helping everyone else to eat. Charlotte noticed the gesture and smiled. "You are learning the rules around here." Vincent returned the smile, smaller than hers but warmer than ever before. "I had an excellent teacher." The words surprised her, not because they sounded unusual, but because they felt completely sincere. Later, after the children had finished dessert, Noah climbed onto the small wooden stage used for holiday performances. "Miss Charlotte," he called, "can you sing before bedtime?" Several children immediately agreed. Charlotte glanced toward Vincent for only a moment before looking back at the eager faces surrounding her. She sat in the old rocking chair that volunteers had carried outside for the evening gathering and began humming the familiar lullaby once again. This time the melody belonged to everyone. Children rested against blankets spread across the lawn. Parents visiting for family night quietly listened from folding chairs. Volunteers paused their conversations. Even the breeze seemed to soften as the final notes drifted beneath the first stars appearing above Seattle. Vincent closed his eyes for only a moment, not to remember the past, but to appreciate the present. 3 centuries earlier, one compassionate woman had believed kindness could survive longer than fear. Sitting only a few feet away, her descendant proved that she had been right, and as the last note faded into the peaceful evening air, Vincent understood that some legacies were never meant to be hidden. They were meant to be lived. The following morning arrived with crisp autumn air drifting through the open windows of Blackwood Children's Shelter, carrying the scent of cedar trees and fresh coffee from a nearby corner cafe. Charlotte arrived before sunrise, just as she always had, unlocking the front door while the city was still waking. The silver pendant rested quietly beneath her apron, no longer feeling like an unanswered question, but like a treasured family keepsake that had finally found its way home. She paused for a moment beside the nursery, smiling as she heard peaceful breathing instead of restless cries. Only a week earlier, sleepless nights had become ordinary inside these walls. Now calm had quietly replaced fear. Downstairs, she began preparing breakfast while humming the familiar lullaby without realizing it. Volunteers gradually filled the kitchen, laughing as they stacked pancakes onto warm plates and poured orange juice into colorful cups. The shelter director stepped inside, carrying a small envelope with Charlotte's name written neatly across the front. "This arrived early this morning," she said. "There is no return address." Charlotte thanked her before opening it carefully. Inside rested a single handwritten note on thick cream-colored paper. It contained only one sentence: "Thank you for keeping the promise alive." No signature appeared beneath the message. Charlotte looked at the words thoughtfully before folding the note and placing it beside the pendant. She assumed someone connected to her grandmother had chosen to remain anonymous. What she did not know was that the note had been delivered by hand before dawn by someone who quietly disappeared long before the first volunteer arrived. Across the dining room, Vincent entered carrying 2 large boxes filled with children's books collected through the Moretti Foundation. The children greeted him with enthusiastic smiles, surrounding him before he had taken 3 steps inside. Noah proudly showed him a spelling quiz marked with a bright gold star, while the pale little boy carefully carried a picture book to the reading corner without waiting for anyone to ask. Vincent watched both boys with quiet satisfaction. Their eyes no longer carried the same uncertainty they had worn only days before. Charlotte approached with a warm cup of coffee. "You seem to be becoming part of the morning routine." Vincent accepted the cup with genuine gratitude. "I believe I have been adopted." Charlotte laughed softly. "That happens quickly around here." After breakfast, the children gathered in the recreation room for story time. Instead of choosing one of the new books, Noah tugged gently on Charlotte's sleeve. "Can you tell us about your grandmother?" Several children nodded eagerly. Charlotte settled into the rocking chair and smiled. She was not famous. She never traveled the world. She simply believed that every child deserved kindness before bedtime. The room grew wonderfully quiet. She shared memories of baking bread together, planting flowers in small window boxes, and singing while folding laundry. Every story sounded ordinary, yet every child listened as though hearing about the greatest hero imaginable. Vincent remained near the back of the room. He realized that Charlotte never exaggerated her grandmother's life because she believed quiet goodness did not need dramatic stories. That simple honesty reminded him exactly why Eleanor had trusted her family so many generations earlier. As the afternoon sun stretched across the playground, the pale little boy walked toward Charlotte holding the carved wooden bird that had comforted him on his first night at the shelter. Without saying a word, he placed it gently into her hands. She looked down in surprise. "Are you sure?" He smiled with complete confidence. "I do not need it anymore." Charlotte carefully accepted the small gift, understanding that it represented far more than carved wood. It was the first thing he had chosen to let go of since arriving. Vincent watched the exchange with quiet admiration, recognizing that true healing rarely announced itself with grand moments. Sometimes it appeared in the simple courage to release what had once been necessary. As golden evening light filled the shelter once again, Charlotte placed the little wooden bird beside the silver pendant on the nursery bookshelf, where both reminders of the past now rested together. no longer preserving forgotten history but quietly encouraging every child who would walk through those doors in the years still waiting to come. Several days passed with a quiet sense of renewal settling over Blackwood Children's Shelter. The building itself seemed unchanged, yet every familiar corner carried a lighter atmosphere. The children laughed more freely in the hallways, volunteers lingered longer after their shifts, and even rainy mornings no longer felt quite as grey. Charlotte noticed the difference in countless little moments. Noah no longer hesitated before joining group activities. The pale little boy eagerly volunteered to read aloud during afternoon story time, his once fragile voice growing steadier with every page. Watching the children regain pieces of themselves filled Charlotte with a quiet happiness that asked for nothing in return. Early one Saturday morning, the shelter organized a community garden day. Families from the neighborhood arrived carrying flower seedlings, vegetable plants, and small gardening tools. Raised wooden beds lined the back courtyard, waiting to be filled with fresh soil before winter arrived. Charlotte rolled up the sleeves of her light sweater and spent the morning helping children dig neat little holes for tulip bulbs and lavender bushes. Every few minutes, someone called her name to admire a crooked row of carrots or a sunflower planted slightly too close to the fence. She praised every effort with the same gentle sincerity. Vincent arrived carrying several young maple trees donated through the Moretti Foundation. Rather than asking others to unload them, he quietly joined the volunteers, lifting bags of soil and assembling wooden supports beside the children. At first, the younger volunteers looked surprised to see someone they associated with boardrooms happily kneeling in the dirt beside 6-year-olds. Within minutes, they stopped noticing the difference. Charlotte smiled as she watched Vincent patiently help Noah straighten a leaning sapling. "You missed a spot," she teased, pointing toward a streak of soil across his sleeve. Vincent looked down before giving a small laugh that would have seemed impossible only a week earlier. "I suspect the tree will forgive me." "Perhaps," Charlotte replied, "but your tailor might not." The children laughed with them, delighted to discover that even serious adults could become muddy while planting trees. Near the edge of the garden stood a weathered stone bench that had remained there longer than anyone could remember. The shelter director explained that it had been donated many decades earlier by an anonymous benefactor. Charlotte brushed away fallen leaves from its surface before noticing a small bronze plaque hidden beneath ivy. Time had faded most of the lettering, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. "Kindness grows where it is given away." Charlotte gently traced the words with her fingertips. "That sounds exactly like something my grandmother would have said." Vincent quietly stepped beside her. "She probably did." Charlotte looked toward him with thoughtful curiosity. "Did she ever know who kept helping the shelter?" Vincent smiled gently. "She once told me that names mattered far less than actions." Charlotte nodded. "That sounds like her." She did not ask another question because she no longer needed every mystery explained. Some answers had already revealed everything that truly mattered. As the afternoon came to an end, the children gathered around the newly planted maple trees, each taking turns pouring one small watering can over the fresh soil. Noah carefully placed a painted wooden sign beside the tallest tree. In colorful letters it read "Hope Tree." The pale little boy quietly added one final touch by hanging a tiny blue ribbon from one of the lowest branches. It fluttered softly in the cool breeze, drawing smiles from everyone nearby. Charlotte reached into her apron pocket and removed the silver pendant. For a long moment she simply held it in her palm, watching sunlight reflect across its worn surface. Then she carefully tucked it inside a small shadow box along with the carved wooden bird and the handwritten note that had arrived without a signature. She asked the shelter director to place the display near the nursery entrance where future generations of children could see it. No names appeared beneath the items, no long explanation accompanied them, only a simple inscription chosen by Charlotte herself. "Every child deserves a place where they feel safe enough to dream." Vincent read the words in silence before looking toward the nursery windows, where children were already laughing together inside. For centuries he had protected priceless relics hidden beneath stone walls, believing history survived because powerful people preserved it. Standing beside Charlotte, he finally understood that the greatest treasures had never belonged inside locked chambers at all. They belonged wherever kindness quietly continued from one generation to the next. The first snow of the season arrived quietly before sunrise, covering the rooftops of Seattle with a thin blanket of white that reflected the early morning light. Blackwood Children's Shelter looked almost unchanged, yet every window glowed with the warmth of a place that had become more than a building. It had become a home. Charlotte unlocked the front door, as she had done countless mornings before, brushing a light layer of snow from the entrance steps before children hurried outside to leave the first footprints of the day. Laughter echoed across the courtyard as Noah proudly declared that he would build the biggest snowman in the neighborhood, while the pale little boy carefully collected smooth stones for its smiling face. Charlotte wrapped scarves around small shoulders, straightened crooked hats, and reminded everyone to wear gloves before running into the fresh snow herself. From the sidewalk across the street, Vincent watched the joyful chaos with a quiet smile. He no longer arrived as a distant visitor. The children waved the moment they spotted him, calling his name with complete confidence that he belonged there. He crossed the street carrying a large wooden sled restored by hand, placing it gently on the snowy hill behind the shelter. Within minutes the yard filled with delighted cheers as children took turns sliding safely down the gentle slope. Charlotte laughed each time someone reached the bottom with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, helping them climb back to the top for another ride. Watching her move from child to child, Vincent realized that nothing about her kindness had changed since the first evening she had stepped into the nursery. She had never tried to become extraordinary. She had simply continued choosing compassion one ordinary moment after another. That was what had made the difference. Later that afternoon, the shelter gathered inside for a small winter celebration. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling. Homemade cookies cooled on long wooden tables. Volunteers, neighbors, and families filled the common room with quiet conversation while children proudly decorated a tall evergreen standing beside the fireplace. Charlotte lifted the silver pendant from the shadow box for only a moment before placing it carefully on one of the highest branches of the tree. Its polished surface caught the firelight, sending tiny reflections across the room. Beside it hung the little carved wooden bird Noah had insisted should remain near the pendant forever. The handwritten note rested safely inside the shadow box beneath the tree, where every visitor could read its simple message. "Thank you for keeping the promise alive." The shelter director gathered everyone together before dinner and cleared her throat with a warm smile. "Many people have supported this home over the years," she said. "Some gave money, some gave time. Others simply gave hope when it was needed most. Today we would like to dedicate this room to every person who believed that no child should ever feel forgotten." Gentle applause filled the room. Charlotte lowered her eyes modestly, certain the words belonged to many people besides herself. Vincent looked toward the old rocking chair near the fireplace, the very chair where a forgotten lullaby had first been heard again. It stood exactly where it always had, no longer surrounded by mystery, but by children reading books together while waiting for dinner. That quiet image meant more than any ancient relic he had protected through the centuries. As evening settled outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. The children gathered around Charlotte one last time before bedtime, asking for the familiar lullaby that had become part of their nightly routine. She smiled, settled gently into the rocking chair, and began to sing. Noah rested against one arm of the chair while the pale little boy quietly leaned against the other. One by one, the children relaxed beneath soft blankets as the melody drifted through the peaceful room. Vincent remained near the doorway, listening without interrupting the moment. 300 years earlier, one compassionate woman had trusted that kindness could outlive fear if someone chose to pass it forward. Looking at Charlotte surrounded by children who now slept without fear, he understood that the promise had never belonged to a single family or a single generation. It belonged to every heart willing to protect another. When the final note faded into silence, Charlotte looked around the nursery and smiled at the peaceful faces surrounding her. Outside, snow continued covering the city in quiet white, while inside the shelter the fire burned warmly. The old pendant shimmered softly on the evergreen tree, and a forgotten lullaby no longer carried the weight of history because it had finally become what it was always meant to be, the comforting sound of a child falling safely asleep.